We begin a new topic now of development and learning. And we're going to begin by considering a dichotomy, a splitting of the cosmos, the universe, into two very different realms. This time not mind and matter, or mind and brain, but nature and nurture. You will have encountered this in your discussions somewhere along the line, although not necessarily under this name. Frequently, questions are asked of behaviors, and the question is posed as if behaviors had two possible distinct origins, one arising in nature and natural law, and the other being the result of education, training, learning, social and cultural factors. When you see this opposition placed this starkly before you, I want to suggest to you that you should be very suspicious of such dichotomous thinking, and that question of whether a behavior, a means of acting, or a way of living in the world is either natural or cultural is not a good question. There's a lot of human concern that underlies the attempts to understand our behaviors as stemming either from natural causes or from social cultural causes. Some of them are reflected in these kinds of statements. If someone says, why did X do Y? And someone else says, well, that's just instinct. They've closed down the discussion completely. Instinct is a word. It goes along with the term hardwired as well. That suggests that one is an automaton. Now, we know enough about life to know that no animal is a machine, that Descartes was wrong, that agency in the world is not restricted to humans. And so when you see a behavior characterized as either instinct or hardwired, whether that be of an animal or of a human, that's a failure to think. Those are not explanatory terms. They are unhelpful terms. But behind this is the kind of concern a parent might have, for example, if their child does something bad and then others look down and say, Johnny killed his grandmother. Was he born bad? In which case Johnny is at fault. Or did his parents make him that way? In which case the parents are at fault. This is also a nature-nurture dichotomy. And it doesn't make sense. We don't decompose into two different sets of influences. When we carve things up like this, nature is portrayed as if it was inevitable, deterministic, something that you can do absolutely nothing about. And culture, on the other hand, is portrayed as if it was entirely free and symbolic. And both of these are simplistic caricatures that obscure the complex intertwinings of many, many factors. It's worth noting at this point, especially in a cognitive science course, that when we speak of science, we are not speaking of a single domain of truth. We are not speaking of a single enterprise that generates a single story. There are many sciences, and part of our task in cognitive science is to recognize that the sciences are plural. Science is a method, is a way of constructing argument that can be relied upon. But the many, many sciences do not add up to a single univocal story about the truth. And so in every field, we will find dichotomous thinking. We will find this kind of partitioning of influences. And in many discussions, that can't be avoided. But we can be sensitive to what we're doing there. And we can recognize when we are simplifying, when we are assuming for the point of view, for the present purposes, a particular partition that we don't want to suggest is a natural kind or a split along the joints of nature. Now, if we consider a single person, human person with their body, if we consider that to be the person, that person has multiple histories. One of the histories is phylogenesis. You got where you were today because life emerged 3.5 billion years ago, and it slowly changed through many generations. Lots and lots of events, lots of going on. Process of evolution changed things along the way, and lo and behold, there you are. That evolutionary history gave rise to you. You're a product of it. We can trace another history that also produced you, and this arises from the moment of conception, when we can first say there's a few cells that we can trace in a continuous line to your present day. That's ontogenesis. This is the development of a single individual organism, a single body, from its formation to the final point of death. Now, these are two histories, and you sit at the conjunction of both. And what you do today depends on both of these. It depends on everything that happened to you from the moment of conception, but it also depends on things that happened long before you. The fact that you can see, the fact that your nose looks like your grandfather, the fact that you have two legs. These are part of your history too. And you don't partition into two selves, one of which arrived biologically formed, and the other of which was superimposed by the impositions of culture and society. So this, when we are blind to this problem, we tend to think that everything can be sorted into distinct categories of the innate, biological, versus the acquired, social-cultural. We can attribute characteristics of the person, their behavior, their personality, to either biology, and that's often cast as genes, versus culture. That is, we do the old nature-nurture distinction. It's as old as the hills. These dichotomies go well back. They are fueled by scientific disagreements, and on analysis, they break down. There's also a lot of theology behind here. I mentioned Descartes, for example, wanted to reserve a different role for humans than he did for all animals. So animals were automata, they were machines, whereas humans were blessed with free souls. We're not driven by those explicit theological concerns, but everyone still likes simple stories. Now, in your required reading for this week, there's an excellent blog post here on the problem of hardwiring, and it points out that genes mean nothing on their own, and genes don't dictate the form of an organism. An organism is dependent on its genes. The genes regulate its process of development, but they do so in interaction with a specific environment. There has never been an organism that grew up without an environment. There has never been a body unconstrained by external influences. And so the human social cultural world is very much part of our environment. It's baked in. As Michael Tomasello, who gave us the cooperative eye hypothesis, said, fish are born expecting water and humans are born expecting culture. Language, of course, sits right here in this nexus where we can't separate these separate influences. When we look then at learning and development, we can see how intertwined these things are. There is a history of studies that try vainly to separate these for specific kinds of discussions. And this was most popular during the what now appears rather simplistic treatment of genes in the 1970s, 1980s, where genes were seen as containing information which would dictate the finished form, the final form of the organism. This is no longer our current story. But with that mindset, twin studies became terribly popular because it was assumed that if we could get twins separated at birth and raised in different environments, preferably identical twins, then we could separate out the distinction between nature and nurture. Identical twins, of course, are the holy grail here because hypothetically they share genes, and if you could separate them at birth, you would have an experiment on your hands, an experiment that actually has been done, but we won't talk about that. Now, Vaughan Bell is a very good psychologist in London, and he wrote this piece for the magazine The Psychologist, and it's very nice. He says, nature versus nurture is a lie. Music is not melody versus rhythm, and wine is not grapes versus alcohol, and we are not environment versus genes. We We live in the middle here. We are their sum, their product, and their expression. They dance together and we are their performance, but neither is an adversary. The art of understanding this elegant ballet is complex and arcane, but you may never realize this from reading the quoted results of genetic studies, because the extent to which a trait is heritable, that is, accounted for by genetics, is usually expressed as a simple percentage, and this hides the complexity of the situation. Genes have no independent meaning. They mean nothing without an organism for whom they can influence and regulate the process of development, and that organism is fully immersed in a specific environment. So we can never completely separate biology and culture, nature and nurture, society from biology. Twin studies are a bit dangerous because they do this problematic partitioning, and when we become aware of the fact that the natural world and the cultural world are not two different worlds, and there is no obvious partitioning we can do, then we can recognize when we are simplifying. There may be contexts in which such a separation is required. It's fairly safe to say that humans may or may not learn to swim, whereas all fish learn to swim. In that case, clearly, for a fish, this is something that's going to happen if you're a fish. Whereas for humans, you may, if you live near the coast, you may learn to swim or you may not learn to swim. That does not suggest an ontological distinction of the natural world into two kinds. So we'll be cautious there.